The first thing you need to understand is that Norah Basset did not go to the Bitterroot Mountains to find herself. She went there to disappear. There is a difference. A profound bone-deep difference that most people never have to learn. Finding yourself implies there is something worth discovering, some hidden reserve of meaning, waiting beneath the wreckage of a life. Disappearing means you have done the math, looked at what remains, and decided that absence is the only logical answer. Norah had done the math many times. In the parking garage of the federal building in Portland, sitting in her car for 2 hours after signing her final deposition. In the fluorescent hallway of a budget motel in Salem, staring at a water-stained ceiling at 3 in the morning. On the shoulder of Interstate 84, engine-running hands, gripping the steering wheel of a rusted 2008 Subaru Outback, watching the semis blow past and wondering what it would feel like to simply stop making decisions. She always started the car again, not because she was optimistic, because she was stubborn. Because somewhere beneath the grief and the fury and the humiliation, Norah Basset was still at her core a structural engineer. And structural engineers do not walk away from a problem. They look at what is broken, they calculate the load, and they figure out how to hold the weight. The question in the fall of that year was whether there was anything left worth holding. She was 54 years old. She had spent 25 years building things, bridges, overpasses, the load-bearing skeletons of buildings that other people would fill with their lives and never think twice about. She had built a career on the principle that structure was everything, that if the foundation was sound, everything above it could be trusted. She had applied that same principle to her marriage. She had been wrong. Gerald Basset was 61 years old when the FBI came for him. Or rather, when the FBI came for the office where they believed he would be, only to find that Gerald Basset had not arrived for work that morning, or the morning before. His assistant, a young man named Patterson, who wore bow ties and made excellent coffee, told the agents that Mr. Basset had left early on Tuesday, citing a personal matter. That had been 72 hours ago. The agents who arrived at Norah's office on that Thursday morning in March were not unkind. They were professional. They read from documents in clear, measured voices. They used words like alleged and pursuant and material involvement. They allowed her to stand, which she appreciated because her legs were shaking badly enough that she was not certain they would support her weight. Her colleagues watched from behind glass partitions. She could see them in her peripheral vision, heads turning, conversations stopping mid-sentence. 23 years of professional credibility dissolving in the time it took a federal agent to read a warrant aloud. The charges were not against Norah, not yet. The agents were careful to clarify that. But the documents they showed her, the shell company registrations, the offshore transfer authorizations, the fund disbursement records, all of them bore her signature. Her professional credentials, her licensed engineer's seal, forged, every single one of them. Forged across a period of 3 years, systematically, meticulously, in a handwriting close enough to her own that even she had to look twice. Gerald Basset had been the chief financial officer of the Pacific Northwest Retiree Investment Fund for 11 years. The fund managed the retirement savings of over 4,000 working-class families, steelworkers, long-haul drivers, electricians, machinists, men and women who had given 40 years of their bodies to their trades and trusted the fund with what little security they had accumulated. Gerald had managed their money with a reputation for conservative, careful stewardship. He gave talks at industry conferences. He served on an ethics board. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings. He had also, over the course of those 11 years, moved $40 million out of the fund and into a network of shell companies so intricate it took a team of forensic accountants 4 months to fully map. The money had been laundered through real estate investments, private equity vehicles, and finally, in the weeks before everything collapsed, into a cold storage cryptocurrency wallet that left no traceable path. The fund was insolvent. 4,000 families had lost everything. And Gerald Basset had vanished, leaving behind a trail of forged documents bearing his wife's name and a note on his home desk that read, simply, "I am sorry." It was not addressed to anyone. Norah's attorney was a woman named Harriet Sloan, sharp-eyed and expensive, who told her from the first meeting that the case against her was circumstantial but serious. The forged signatures were convincing. Her name was on documents authorizing transfers to accounts she had never heard of. The prosecution would argue she had been complicit, that the marriage was a partnership in more than the conventional sense. Harriet was also honest. She told Norah that winning would cost everything she had, and that even winning would not restore what was lost. She was right on both counts. 5 months. 5 months of depositions, document reviews, financial audits that stripped her life down to its component parts and examined each one under a lens. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her professional license was suspended pending investigation. She moved out of the house, Gerald's house she now understood paid for with other people's money, and into a 2-room apartment in a neighborhood she did not recognize. The SEC cleared her. The FBI cleared her. The federal prosecutor, after reviewing Harriet's evidence, declined to file charges. Norah Basset was officially and legally innocent. It did not matter. The fund's bankruptcy receiver filed a civil suit naming her as a potential defendant. 3 news outlets had run her photograph alongside Gerald's under headlines that used phrases like power couple and fraud scheme. Her engineering firm, citing an abundance of caution, did not renew her contract. 2 professional colleagues she had known for 15 years stopped returning her calls. By August, Norah had $4,200 in a bank account that was no longer frozen a car with 140,000 miles on it, and a name that, when typed into an internet search, returned 47 pages of articles about her husband's crimes. She also had a postcard. It had arrived in late August, 2 weeks before she packed the Subaru and drove east toward Idaho. It came in a stack of mail forwarded from the old house, mostly creditor notices and junk that had not gotten the update. The postcard was glossy printed on heavy stock, advertising the services of a financial planning company called Harborview Wealth Management. The front showed a stock photograph of a calm harbor at sunrise. The back had a Portland address printed in small type, a toll-free number, and in the space for a personal message, 12 lines of handwriting that she recognized immediately as Gerald's. The poem, if that was the right word for it, was strange. It listed trees and birds in an order that seemed almost deliberate: cedar, hawk, birch, osprey, pine, and so on for 12 lines. Each line paired a tree with a bird. It did not rhyme. It did not scan. It read like a man who had learned what poetry was from a description, but had never actually encountered one. Norah stared at it for a long time. Then she put it in the leather journal she kept by her bed between 2 pages near the back. She did not know why she kept it. It seemed at the time like the last communication of a man who did not know how to say what he needed to say, and had defaulted to saying nothing meaningful at all. She did not think about it again for nearly 2 months. She was too busy building a house. Boundary County, Idaho, sits in the northernmost finger of the state, pressed against the Canadian border, surrounded by the Selkirk and Purcell mountain ranges. The Kootenai River runs through the valley. The towns are small and practical, built by and for people who work with their hands. The nearest city of any significant size is Spokane, 3 hours south. The roads as you move into the mountains go from highway to 2-lane to gravel to dirt, and then they stop entirely. Norah drove until the GPS signal became unreliable, and the cell service indicator on her phone showed nothing. Then she drove a little further. She found Silas Thorne through a handwritten notice on a bulletin board outside a feed store in a town called Rimrock Population, according to the sign at the town line, 840. The notice offered 5 acres of wooded hillside for $3,000 cash, no agents, no financing call, or stop by. She stopped by. Silas Thorne was in his 70s, thin and weather-darkened, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent decades reading terrain and weather. He drove her out to the parcel in a truck that was older than Norah's car, along a logging road that was more suggestion than path. The land was a 45-degree slope, heavily forested with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, accessible only by that single overgrown track. From the top of the slope, looking down through the trees, you could see a long drop into a gorge where a creek ran silver and cold. Silas told her what she already knew. The slope was too severe for a conventional foundation. The soil was packed clay, over shale, unstable, when wet, prone to sliding during snowmelt. Anything built on the surface would be down in the gorge by April. Norah told him she would take it. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man who has seen enough of the world to know the difference between foolishness and a plan he does not yet understand. Then he counted the cash she handed him and gave her the deed. She set up her canvas tent on the flattest section of the logging trail on September 2nd. The air already carried the first metallic edge of autumn, the smell of cooling pine, and the particular dryness that precedes the first frost. Mountain wisdom said the first real snow would not arrive until late November. She had, by most reasonable estimates, 10 to 12 weeks. She intended to spend every hour of them. The plan was not complicated, but it required complete confidence in principles that most people never have reason to consider. Norah had spent her career thinking about how structures interact with the earth beneath them, how loads transfer through foundations, how soil behaves under stress, how the ground itself can be an asset or a liability depending on how you approach it. A hillside in conventional construction is a problem. The slope creates instability. You fight it with concrete and steel and drainage systems and retaining walls. But if you stopped fighting the hillside and instead borrowed into it, the calculation changed entirely. A dugout, a structure excavated directly into a slope, used the earth as its walls. The soil that would otherwise undermine a foundation became the foundation itself. And below the frost line, which in northern Idaho sits roughly 4 feet down the ground, temperature stabilized at a consistent 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Not warm enough to be comfortable on its own, but warm enough to prevent the catastrophic heat loss that killed people in mountain winters. The earth would be her insulation. The earth would be her walls. The earth would hold her together. She rented a battered mini excavator from a man named Walt Kessler, who ran a small equipment rental operation out of a hardware store in Rimrock. Walt was the kind of man who asked exactly one question, cash or card, and otherwise kept his opinions to himself, which Norah appreciated. The machine cost her $600 for 1 week, which was a significant fraction of what remained of her money. But the alternative was months of hand-digging alone, and she did not have months. She had the machine for 7 days. In those 7 days, working from first light until she could no longer see the grade stakes she had driven into the slope, she carved a rectangular shelf into the hillside. 12 feet deep, 16 feet wide, with a back wall of raw earth rising 10 feet behind the excavated space. The machine groaned and shuddered on the steep grade, and twice she came close enough to the edge of stability that she stopped and sat very still for a moment before continuing. But she knew slopes. She knew how to read the soil and where the safe angles were. On the 7th day, the diesel ran out with the excavation nearly complete. She refueled from a spare can she had purchased in advance and finished the last corner of the shelf by hand, with a mattock moving 200 pounds of clay and rock that the machine had left behind. Then she drove the excavator back to Walt Kessler, paid the balance, and returned to the mountain with nothing but hand tools and time. The timber framing took 2.5 weeks. Norah felled lodgepole pines from the slope above her excavation, selecting straight trunk trees of consistent diameter, cutting them with a chainsaw she had purchased at a pawn shop in Sandpoint for $80. She limbed them on the slope, cut them to length, and dragged them down by hand and by rope to the worksite. Her hands, which had spent 2 decades holding blueprints and drafting pencils and coffee cups in climate-controlled offices, learned in those weeks what tools were actually for. She built the frame using mortise and 10-on joinery, cutting the joints by hand, with a chisel and mallet fitting each connection with a precision that she had once designed on computer software, and now executed in raw wood with aching arms and a headlamp strapped to her forehead. She had modeled structures like this in 3 dimensions on a screen, understanding them physically, feeling the weight of each timber. Learning how a joint that was 1/16th of an inch out of square would bind and resist was a different kind of knowledge. It lived in the body rather than the mind. She lined the earthen back and side walls with heavy-duty plastic sheeting stapled to stakes. She drove into the soil, creating a moisture barrier that would redirect groundwater away from the interior. Against this, she stacked horizontal logs notched into the corner posts to hold the earth back from the living space. It was slow, exacting work done mostly in silence, broken only by the sounds of the mountain wind through the pines, the distant call of a hawk, the occasional crack of a branch settling in the cooling temperatures. She lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks. She ate protein bars and canned soup heated over a propane burner. She fell into her tent each night with her muscles spasming from exertion, lying still until the worst of it passed, sleeping the absolute sleep of a body that had used itself completely. She woke before dawn and started again. In the deep physical exhaustion of those days, something happened that she had not expected. The noise in her head, the endless cycling of betrayal and humiliation, and loss and fury that had been her constant companion since March began to quiet. Not to disappear, not to resolve, but to reduce to a frequency she could live alongside rather than one that drowned everything else out. She was not healing. She was not processing or moving forward or any of the therapeutic language that well-meaning people had used at her. She was simply working so hard that there was no room for anything else, and that absence of room felt for the first time in months like something close to peace. By September 28th, she had a solid three-sided wooden box embedded in the hillside. The back wall and two side walls were complete timber-framed, moisture-barriered, structurally sound. The front of the structure faced the slope's downhill view, looking out over the gorge and the valley beyond. And it was framed out but open, awaiting the front wall and the door. The sky above the pines had changed. The brilliant hard blue of early September had given way to something lower and heavier, a gray that pressed down on the mountain with a particular weight that Norah recognized. She had grown up in Montana before moving west for school and work. She knew what mountain sky looked like when it was thinking about winter. But the forecasts were uniform. Late November for the first significant snow. She had weeks. October 4th arrived with a pressure change so abrupt that Norah's ears popped while she was working mortar for the stove hearth. She looked up from the bucket in her hands and saw the clouds, not the gentle gray of the past week, but something dark and churning, stacked in columns above the ridgeline, like something with intention. The wind that came up the valley an hour later carried a cold that was different in quality from autumn cold. It was the cold of high altitude and Arctic pressure, the kind that does not announce itself but simply arrives and begins. The birds had been gone for 2 days. She had not noticed until now. Norah dropped the mortar bucket and moved to the timber frame. She had planned to spend another week on the front wall and the door to do it properly, with insulated panels and fitted weather stripping and a threshold that would keep the cold out. That plan ended on October 4th. What replaced it was speed. The roof came first because without it nothing else mattered. She had sourced 12-inch diameter Douglas fir logs for the rafters, carrying them up the logging trail. In a borrowed truck she had paid a Rimrock resident $20 to lend her for an afternoon. She laid them across the top of the frame, at close spacing, their weight resting on the front and back walls of the structure, creating a dense wooden ceiling strong enough to bear what she intended to pile on top. Across the rafters she nailed thick pine planks salvaged from a demolished outbuilding she had found on Silas Thorne's adjacent property, bought for $50 and torn apart with a pry bar over a long afternoon. Over the planks went 2 overlapping layers of reinforced pond liner, a waterproof membrane she had driven 3 hours south to Coeur d'Alene to procure, paying more than she wanted to for a product she could not afford to compromise on. Then she put the mountain back. For 3 days running on coffee and adrenaline, and a stubborn refusal to consider the alternative, she shoveled the excavated earth and clay that she had piled to the side of the dig back onto the roof. She moved it by wheelbarrow, 1 load at a time, up a ramp she had built from salvaged planks, dumping it in even layers across the pond liner, and tamping it down with a section of log. She dragged back and forth until her arms were shaking. 2 feet of earth, compacted and level, covering the roof from one end to the other. When she was finished, the structure had effectively vanished into the hillside. If you did not know exactly where to look, you would walk past it. The mountain had taken it back, or appeared to. Her back hurt in a way that suggested she had done something to it that a doctor would have opinions about. She did not have a doctor. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours on the afternoon of October 8th. It began as cold rain, the kind that finds every gap in your clothing and settles against the skin. The clay around the dugout turned immediately slick, and Norah scrambled on the slope as she worked to finish the front wall, nailing planks across the open frame with hands that had stopped feeling their extremities an hour earlier. She packed the gaps between the planks with a mixture of mud and dried pine needles and moss, pulled from rocks nearby, improvised chinking. Rough and inelegant but functional. She had not had time to build the insulated door she had designed in her head during the excavation weeks. What she had instead was a solid core door she had found at the Rimrock transfer station, salvaged from a house demolition, heavy and thick, but uninsulated, hung on iron hinges she had bolted through the front framing. Around the door frame she nailed layers of heavy canvas overlapping the edges to block drafts. At 4 in the afternoon the rain turned to snow. Not the gentle first snow of a normal mountain autumn, but a driving horizontal assault that reduced visibility to 10 feet and accumulated at a rate that made Norah stop what she was doing and simply watch it for a moment in quiet disbelief. 7 weeks early, she went inside, pulled the canvas tight across the doorframe, seated the wooden bar that served as a latch, and knelt in front of the small cast-iron wood stove she had bolted to a stone hearth in the back left corner of the space. She had spent 2 days fitting the stovepipe through the roof with improvised flashing, a detail that had felt almost excessive at the time and now felt like the most important thing she had ever done. She held a match to the kindling. The dry pine caught immediately, the small bright flame consuming the thin sticks and reaching for the larger pieces stacked around them. She watched the pipe. She listened for the sound of smoke drawing cleanly upward. It drew. The smoke rose and went up and out, and the first genuine heat she had felt in 3 days began to radiate from the iron surface of the stove. The storm outside built to something extraordinary over the next 2 hours. The wind did not gust so much as roar, a sustained, relentless force that pushed against the front wall of the dugout and found nothing to give. The snow compacted against the canvas of the door, muffling the sound of the world outside until the blizzard felt distant, theoretical, something happening to someone else. Inside, the miracle that Norah had staked her life on began to reveal itself. The thermal mass of 3 feet of earth above her head and the compacted clay of the walls around her absorbed the heat from the stove and held it, releasing it slowly back into the space at a rate that kept the interior temperature stable. Within 2 hours, the inside of the dugout had reached 65 degrees. While the ambient temperature outside had fallen to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected person in under an hour, the inside of the mountain held steady and warm. She stripped off her outer layers, soaked through from the scramble to finish the front wall. She unpacked her sleeping bag and wrapped it around her shoulders and sat on the wooden cot frame she had built from salvaged 2x4s, listening to the muffled roar of the wind through 3 feet of earth and the snapping of pine in the iron stove. She had built a structure that worked. Against every reasonable expectation, against a hillside that Silas Thorne had told her nothing could stand on, against a storm that had arrived 7 weeks before anyone predicted, she had built something that held. The kerosene lantern on the plywood shelf threw a steady orange light across the earthen walls. The stovepipe ticked and settled. Outside, the storm pressed down on the mountain, and the mountain absorbed it without complaint. Norah Basset, for the first time since March, felt something that was not fear or grief or exhaustion. She felt secure. She sat with that feeling, careful with it, the way you are careful with something fragile that you have not held in a long time. She ate a can of soup heated on the stove and read 3 pages of a novel she had carried in her pack for 2 months without opening. The words did not entirely resolve into meaning, she was too tired for that. But the act of reading felt like a declaration of some kind, like proof that she still intended to have an inner life. She was asleep by 8 o'clock. The storm hammered the mountain through the night and into the next day. Norah fed the stove in regular intervals, melted snow for water in a cast iron pot, rationed her food with the calm calculation of someone who has done the arithmetic and knows how long the numbers hold. The walls held, the roof held. The cold stopped at the surface and went no further. For 2 days she existed in a kind of suspended simplicity that she did not have a word for. The world outside, the federal investigators, the civil lawsuit that was still technically pending, the 47 pages of search results. The colleagues who had stopped calling the house in Portland that now belonged to creditors. All of it was out there somewhere beyond 3 feet of Idaho earth and a howling October storm. And she was in here, warm, dry, alone. It was exactly what she had wanted. She would remember that thought later. She would remember the precise quality of the satisfaction she felt on the evening of October 10th, sitting in her sleeping bag with the lantern burning and the storm at its peak, thinking that she had finally gotten what she came for. She would remember it because of what happened next. The sound came from outside the door, below the constant roar of the wind, below the percussion of the stovepipe expanding in the heat. A rhythmic impact, slow and deliberate. Once. A pause. Again. Norah set down her cup. The sound came again. Slower this time. Weaker. She sat very still in the orange light of the lantern and listened to a sound she had not heard in 2 months. The sound of someone somewhere nearby in serious trouble. She did not move immediately. The instinct was not to open the door, but to go still the way a person goes still. When the world outside the perimeter of safety makes a sound that does not belong. She sat on the edge of her cot and listened. 3 impacts, slow and deliberate, against the thick wood of the salvage door. Not a branch, not debris carried by the wind. The rhythm was wrong for that, too irregular, too intentional. Something with a purpose was on the other side of that door. She reached under the cot without taking her eyes off the canvas hanging across the doorframe. Her hand found the stock of the 12-gauge shotgun she had purchased from a licensed dealer in Sandpoint 6 weeks ago. She had bought slugs rather than shot. Slugs for bears. Slugs for whatever came out of a storm that had no business being as severe as it was 7 weeks ahead of its time. She stood, chambered around. The mechanical sound filled the small earthen room with a clarity that cut through the noise of the blizzard. One more impact against the door, softer this time. Then, barely audible beneath the roaring wind, a sound that rearranged everything. A voice. 2 words muffled and broken by the storm but unmistakably human. Please, help. Norah crossed the room in 4 steps. She put her back against the wall beside the door, rather than directly behind it, and held the shotgun at her shoulder. "Who's there?" Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She had not spoken aloud in 4 days. Silence. Then fainter. Can't stand up. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Not opening the door meant leaving a human being in 10-degree temperatures and a full blizzard. She lifted the wooden bar, pulled the canvas aside, and cracked the door 2 inches. The wind hit her like a wall. Snow drove through the gap and the stove hissed as flakes reached it. In the narrow vertical slice of blizzard white that the cracked door revealed, she saw a shape large, slumped, one arm raised in an attempt to reach the door that had apparently failed. "Get up," she said. "I can't hold the door with one hand." "My leg, I can't put weight on it." She set the shotgun against the wall within reach, grabbed the doorframe and used her body weight to pull the door against the wind. It swung wider. She reached down and got both hands into the collar of a heavy parka and pulled. The man was large and completely limp, and dragging him over the threshold while fighting the door in a blizzard was one of the harder physical tasks she had performed in a month of extremely hard physical tasks. She got him inside by inches, the storm screaming through the open door, until she could finally kick it shut and drop the wooden bar back into its bracket. The lantern had blown out. She stood in near darkness, lit only by the orange glow of the stove's air vents. Breathing hard with a man she had never seen before, lying face up on her dirt floor. She picked up the lantern and relit it. The light showed her what she was dealing with, and what she was dealing with was serious. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, with a face that might, under normal circumstances, have been described as rugged, but was currently the color of old candle wax. His lips had gone a blue-gray that she recognized as the peripheral shutdown of a body in advanced hypothermia. He was conscious, barely, his eyes tracking her movement with the slow focus of someone operating at the edge of capacity. But it was his right leg that held her attention. The thigh of his hiking pants, expensive high-end technical fabric, the kind sold in stores with exposed brick and pour-over coffee, was shredded from mid-thigh down, the torn edges dark and stiff with blood that had partially frozen during his time outside. The shape of the leg was wrong. Not just injured, but geometrically wrong. The thigh too thick in one place, angled in a way that the human femur was not designed to angle. Norah knelt beside him and looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she looked at his face. "Your name." "Cole." He exhaled the word more than spoke it. "Cole Draven." "What happened to your leg, Cole?" "Avalanche. Came off the ridge. Rock underneath. I think it's broken." She already knew it was broken. What she was determining was the nature of the break, because that was what would determine the next hour of both their lives. She took a knife from her belt, slid it under the torn fabric, and cut upward in one clean motion. What she saw made her breath go short for just a moment before her engineering brain stepped in front of her human reaction and took over. The femur, the longest and strongest bone in the human body, had fractured completely through the midshaft. The broken proximal end had been driven outward by the violent contraction of the surrounding musculature, punching through the skin and presenting itself to the cold air. The wound was roughly 2 inches across. The bone itself was visible white and stark against the dark tissue surrounding it, glistening in the lantern light. The cold had slowed the bleeding. That was the only reason he was still alive. In the warmth of the dugout, that would change. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," Norah said. "You have a compound fracture of your femur. Do you know what that means?" Cole's eyes found hers. "The bone is through the skin." "Yes, the bone is through the skin and you are very close to the femoral artery. When you warm up, you are going to start bleeding at a rate that will kill you in minutes if I don't control it right now." She held his gaze. "I am a structural engineer, not a doctor. But I know mechanics and I know what is happening in your leg, and I am going to tell you what I'm going to do before I do it. Do you understand?" He nodded. One small movement. "Good." She worked from the trauma kit she had purchased in Boise before driving north. A decision she had made not out of paranoia, but out of the same methodical risk assessment that had governed every preparation for this winter. Remote location, no roads in winter, chainsaw work. The risk profile demanded supplies. The tourniquet went on first, a nylon windlass device positioned high on the thigh just below the groin, where it could compress the femoral artery at a point proximal to the injury. She tightened it with the windlass rod, cranking it until Cole's body arched off the floor, and a sound came out of him that had no voice behind it, only air and agony. The bleeding slowed to a seep. She checked her watch. 7:43 in the evening. She had roughly 2 hours before ischemic damage to the lower limb became irreversible. The bone had to go back. The thigh muscles, the largest muscle group in the human body, had contracted violently around the fracture site, pulling the broken ends past each other and driving the proximal fragment outward through the skin. Until that mechanical imbalance was corrected, the wound could not be properly cleaned and packed. She needed to apply traction, sustained longitudinal tension along the axis of the limb to overcome the muscle contraction and allow the bone to return to approximate anatomical position. She could not do this with her hands alone. She needed mechanical advantage. She looked up at the central pillar of the frame, a 10-inch lodgepole pine she had set in a prepared hole during the first week of construction. Its base embedded in concrete, she had mixed by hand its top mortised into the main ridge beam. She had built it to hold the weight of 2 feet of compacted earth and the dynamic snow load of an Idaho winter. It would hold what she needed it to hold now. She took 30 feet of static climbing rope from her gear bag. She tied an anchor around the base of the pillar, ran the rope back to Cole's right ankle over his boot, which she left on because removing it would cost time she did not have, and rigged a trucker's hitch with a loop and a carabiner that gave her a 3-to-1 mechanical advantage. Every pound of force she applied to the hauling end of the system would deliver 3 pounds of tension to his leg. She poured isopropyl alcohol directly into the wound first. The sound Cole made when the alcohol hit exposed bone was the kind of sound she pushed immediately out of her memory, because she had to keep working. She put the leather handle of a work glove in his hands and told him to grip it with both hands and not to let go. She positioned herself with her back to the pillar, the rope over her shoulder, her boots braced against the compacted dirt floor. "On 3, she said. "Do not try to help. Do not move. If you move, you will make it worse." She pulled on 3. The rope went taut with a sound like a bowstring. She threw her weight backward, locking her knees, pulling with her legs and her back and everything she had. Cole's body moved across the floor an inch, 2 inches, as the tension transferred into the limb, and then she felt the resistance change as the force reached the muscle and began to fight it. It was like pulling against a steel cable embedded in concrete. The quadriceps in spasm are remarkable in their resistance. She held the tension, breathing through her teeth, her heels driving into the earth, and for a long moment nothing happened, except that every muscle in her back screamed at her, and Cole's hands white-knuckled the glove handle, and the storm continued to roar above them. Then the resistance shifted. Subtly at first, a slight change in the quality of the tension, the way a structural load redistributes in the moment before a joint moves. She felt it through the rope, the same way she had once felt load paths through building models, through instinct built from years of applied mechanics. She pulled harder. The sound was wet and definitive, a single syllable that contained the entire terrible event of a displaced bone returning to its channel through damaged tissue. Cole's body went rigid for 1 second and then completely slack. He had lost consciousness. The pain had exceeded what the nervous system was willing to process while remaining online. Norah tied off the rope to hold the traction. She moved back to the wound. The bone was no longer visible. She worked quickly, irrigating the wound cavity with the remaining isopropyl alcohol, and then a full bottle of sterile saline, flushing the debris of contamination out of the tissue as thoroughly as she could manage without surgical tools. She packed the cavity with hemostatic gauze from the trauma kit, then wrapped the entire thigh in overlapping layers of compression bandage starting at the knee and working upward. For the splint, she took 2 lengths of 2x4 lumber from the stack she had kept for concrete forming. She padded them with torn strips of a fleece blanket and positioned them one along the lateral surface of the leg from hip to ankle, one along the medial surface from groin to ankle, and bound them in place with silver duct tape, pulling each wrap tight before moving to the next. She released the tourniquet, slowly watching the white bandaging over the wound. A small circle of red appeared through the compression wrap. She stared at it, counting seconds, watching for the spread that would tell her the artery had been compromised. The circle did not grow. She exhaled. It was 9:22 in the evening. She had been working for 1 hour and 39 minutes. Her hands, both of them to the wrists, were covered in blood that had already begun to dry and crack at her knuckles. The dirt floor of the dugout had been transformed. Cold Draven was breathing shallow, too fast but continuous. She pulled a wool blanket over him and sat down against the earthen wall with her back to the moisture barrier sheeting and her knees drawn up to her chest. She had saved his life for tonight. What tomorrow looked like was a different problem. He was feverish by midnight. She had expected it: open fracture, contaminated wound, wilderness conditions. But expecting it and watching it were different experiences. By 2 in the morning, his skin was radiating heat that she could feel with her palm held an inch above his forehead. And by 4 o'clock, his temperature was 103.4. She kept the stove stoked and pressed cold compresses snow-packed into a wool sock against his neck and forehead in rotation, watching his chest rise and fall with the vigilance of someone who has accepted responsibility for a life and understands exactly what that acceptance means. He was not peaceful in sleep. His hands moved, his head turned from side to side. He muttered words that were fragments of conversations happening somewhere inside a feverish brain that had retreated from the present into some internal landscape where the rules were different. Most of it was noise, parts of sentences without context, names she did not recognize. Then somewhere around 4:30 in the morning of October 11th, Cold Draven said 3 words in a row that stopped Norah's hand halfway to his forehead. Harborview Shell Company. She sat very still. His head rolled to the other side. He muttered something inaudible. Then, Basset moved it cold. Don't let them... He trailed off. Norah set the compress down on the plywood shelf. Harborview, the name on the postcard. The glossy stalk with the harbor photograph, the toll-free number, the 12 lines of pear trees and birds in Gerald's handwriting. Harborview Wealth Management. A company she had looked up once and found no record of, which had not surprised her, because Gerald's entire architecture of deception had been built on entities that existed on paper and nowhere else. This man lying on her floor with a broken femur and a temperature of 103 knew the name Harborview. He had said it in the context of her last name and the word cold as in cold wallet. The offline cryptocurrency storage where, according to the forensic accountants who had deposed her for 5 hours in June, Gerald had moved the final $40 million before he disappeared. Norah stood up. She moved to the large tactical nylon pack she had dragged inside with coal when she pulled him through the door, which she had pushed against the wall and not examined because she had been occupied with keeping him alive. She looked at it now with different eyes. It was not a hiking pack. The frame was wrong. The weight distribution was wrong. The attachment points were positioned for load management rather than trail comfort. She unclipped the main buckles and opened the top. No tent, no sleeping pad, no food beyond a single emergency ration bar, no camp stove, no fuel canister. What the pack contained instead, a matte black satellite phone with a badly cracked screen, a pair of Swarovski binoculars in a padded case, a spare magazine for a 9mm handgun, and secured in a watertight Pelican hard case with polymer latch buckles, something she did not open immediately because she already had a reasonable idea of what she would find. She opened it. A Glock 19 matte finish 1 round in the chamber. She verified this by feel and reset the action without discharging it, then set the pistol back in the foam cutout. Beside it, sealed in a Ziploc bag, was a manila folder. She carried the folder to the table. The first page was a photograph, 8x10 printed on photo paper, showing a woman loading bags of concrete mix into the back of a Subaru Outback in the parking lot of a hardware store. The woman was Norah. The hardware store was in Sandpoint. The photograph had been taken based on the light and what she was wearing in mid-July, the week she had driven south to buy supplies before returning to Boundary County to begin excavation. Someone had been watching her in July. She turned to the next page. A copy of the property deed she had signed with Silas Thorne, notarized and recorded in Boundary County. Behind it, her bank statements, all of them showing the withdrawal of $3,000 in cash and the subsequent smaller withdrawals for equipment and supplies. Behind those, a printed dossier on heavy stock paper formatted like a professional intelligence brief. She read it slowly. Target: Norah Basset. Nick Calloway. Age 54. Former senior structural engineer, Portland, Oregon. Status cleared of federal criminal charges. March through August current year. Civil liability pending. Believed to be in possession of Harborview cold wallet seed phrase transmitted by Gerald Basset prior to subject's departure from Portland. Location confirmed, Boundary County, Idaho. Objectives: establish contact, extract seed phrase location. Secure cooperation by any means operationally appropriate. Client Retiree Recovery Alliance. She set the folder down on the plywood table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Draven, a private recovery operation, hired by the alliance of retirees and their families, the people who had lost everything when Gerald's fund collapsed. They had found her. They had been watching her since July. They had sent a man into the Bitterroot Mountains in October, ahead of the worst early storm in 2 decades, to extract information from her. She had saved that man's life. "You shouldn't have opened that." The voice was rough and low and came from the floor behind her. Norah turned. Cole was awake. His eyes were fever-bright, sunken deep in a face the color of ash, but they were focused and tracking with the precision of someone who had been lying still and listening for longer than she had realized. She did not move away from the table. "Who are you?" "You already read it." He shifted, and the movement pulled something in his leg because his face went tight and white before he controlled it. "I'm what it says I am. A recovery agent. That's one word for it. What's another word for it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Desperate," he said finally. "Desperate is another word for it." She pulled the chair from the table and sat down facing him. She wanted the table between herself and the pelican case. She noted that he had not looked at it. "How long have you been following me?" "Since Sandpoint, July." His voice was effortful but even. "You covered your tracks reasonably well. Paid cash, no consistent pattern of visits to the same suppliers. But you rented the Excavator from Kessler under your real name because you needed a state ID for the insurance hold. That's how we found the county." "The deed was publicly recorded," she said. "Yes." "So you've known exactly where I was since early September?" "Since the deed recorded, yes." "And you waited until October to come up here?" "We wanted to confirm the site was established, that you were staying." A pause. "And we were hoping you'd come down on your own before winter set in. Make contact easier." "I didn't come down." "No." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again with visible effort. "You really didn't." He told her about the alliance when she pressed him. Not immediately. There was a negotiation in the silence. First, a mutual assessment that two people conduct when they are alone in a small space in a storm, and they both know the normal social rules do not apply. The Retiree Recovery Alliance had formed in the months following the collapse of Gerald's fund. It was not a formal legal entity. The official civil recovery process was moving through the courts, with the speed of coal tar, with mounting legal fees consuming the potential recovery before it arrived. The alliance was a parallel effort, privately funded by a consortium of former fund investors who had the resources to act outside the court process and the motivation to move faster. They had hired a forensic financial team to trace Gerald's money. That team had mapped the shell company structure, identified the Harborview entities, and traced the final transfer of $40 million to a cold storage cryptocurrency wallet. Without the seed phrase, a specific sequence of 12 words that functioned as the master password to the entire account, the money was permanently inaccessible. No court order could compel a blockchain to release funds. No forensic accountant could reconstruct the seed phrase from transaction records. Gerald had sent those 12 words to Norah. "He mailed them to you disguised," Cole said. "The forensic team intercepted his communications in the weeks before he disappeared. He sent you a postcard from a shell company address. The seed phrase is embedded in the content. The postcard, the harbor photograph, the 12 lines of trees and birds." Norah said nothing. Cole watched her face with eyes that were professionally trained to read what faces withheld. Whatever he saw there settled something in his expression. "You have it." "I have a postcard from a company that doesn't exist with a poem on the back that doesn't make sense," Norah said carefully. "I kept it because it was the last thing Gerald sent me." "Do you know what's in it?" "I know what you've told me is in it." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. It's not. Then Cole said, "My father worked sheet metal for 38 years, union shop in Tacoma. He put $700 a month into that fund for the last 22 years of his career. When it collapsed, he lost $280,000. He is 67 years old. He went back to work 4 months ago because he cannot pay his mortgage otherwise." Norah looked at him. "He doesn't know I'm here." Cole continued. "He thinks I'm on a consulting job in Boise. He would not have approved of the methods." A long breath. "He still believes in the legal process. He believes the courts will make it right eventually." "Will they? Maybe 30 cents on the dollar in 4 or 5 years, after attorney fees." He held her gaze. "I don't have 4 or 5 years to watch him work construction at 67. Something shifted in the air between them. Two people standing in the wreckage of the same disaster, looking at the rubble from different angles. "I didn't know about any of it," Norah said. It was not a defense. It was just the truth stated into the space between them, where it could be evaluated without ceremony. "I know," Cole said. She had not expected that. "You know, I've been building a profile on you for 4 months. I've read every document from your case. I've talked to your former colleagues, your neighbors, your attorney's paralegal." He shifted, grimaced, controlled it. "You're not a woman who would have been complicit in defrauding retirees. The psychology doesn't fit. The lifestyle doesn't fit. A woman with $40 million in a crypto wallet doesn't dig a house into a hillside with a rented excavator and a pawn shop chainsaw. And yet here you are." "And yet here I am," he agreed. "Because it doesn't matter whether you knew. It matters that you have the phrase." It was nearly dawn when Cole told her about Gerald. "Gerald was in Costa Rica," Cole said. The past tense landed in the room like a stone. "Was?" Norah said. "He died on September the 15th. Cole's voice was level and without observable satisfaction. "A cartel affiliate found him at a hotel in San Jose. He had attempted to pay them for protection using the Harborview funds, but he had already transferred everything to the cold wallet and couldn't access the amounts he'd promised. They didn't accept the explanation." September 15th. 2 weeks after she had arrived on this mountain and begun digging. Gerald had been dead for nearly a month while she was building the frame and laying the roof and shoveling earth back onto the ceiling of her own making. She tried to find the grief and could not locate it. Gerald Basset was dead in a hotel bathroom in Costa Rica, killed by people he had tried to pay with money that belonged to 67-year-old sheet metal workers. And the world continued to turn, and the storm continued to push on the mountain, and the stove continued to burn. "The seed phrase," she said. "Without it, the money is permanently inaccessible. $40 million mathematically sealed forever, unless someone has the phrase." She was quiet for a long moment. "There's a device in my pack," Cole said eventually. "Front pocket, yellow ruggedized casing. It's an emergency locator beacon. Trigger it when the storm breaks and it will call a Medevac." Norah retrieved it from the pack and held it in the lantern light. She turned it over in her hands with the slow attention of someone who has spent a professional lifetime reading the physical language of engineered objects. The weight was right for what he described. The ruggedized casing was consistent with maritime emergency equipment. The yellow color was standard for civilian rescue devices. But the details were wrong. There was no NOAA insignia, no FCC identification marking, no 406 MHz frequency notation, which was the international standard for civilian personal locator beacons. The frequency that bounced signals off satellites to government search and rescue coordination centers. Instead, there was a small alphanumeric keypad beneath a rubber protective flap, and the antenna was sheathed in what appeared to be RF shielding material. The kind of construction used in encrypted tactical communications equipment, not consumer safety devices. She set it on the table. "This isn't a civilian beacon," she said. Cole's eyes, which had been closed, opened. He looked at the device on the table and then at her face, and whatever he read there was apparently definitive, because the slight tension in his expression resolved into something that was not quite resignation, but was in the same family. "Who does it call?" Norah asked. A long pause. "Cole." Her voice was quiet and even. "You have a compound femur fracture and a fever that is going to become septic within the next 48 hours. I am the only person within many miles who has any reason to keep you alive, and I have been doing that at considerable personal inconvenience. Tell me who this device calls." "Bonner's Ferry," he said. "There's a team there. 4 men, private contractors, former military. They have a helicopter on standby, a Bell 412 winterized. When the storm clears enough to fly, they come in." "And then what happens?" He was quiet. "Cole, they take us both out. You cooperate with the recovery. You provide the seed phrase and we verify it accesses the wallet. You receive a finder's consideration $5 million wire transfer to an account of your choice." He stopped. "And then you disappear. Permanently this time with enough money to actually do it. And if I don't cooperate?" He did not answer, which was its own answer. Norah looked at the tactical transponder on the table. She looked at the Pelican case. She looked at Cole Draven, who had been sent into the mountains to find her, and had instead been carried into her home half dead, and put back together by the woman he had come to coerce, and who was now lying on her floor, looking at her with something that had stopped being professional assessment some hours ago. She looked at the satellite phone on the floor retrieved from the pack beside the Glock. The screen was cracked from corner to corner, dark and apparently dead. Apparently. She picked it up and carried it to the table and sat down. She opened the toolbox she kept on the shelf beside the stove. Wire strippers. A voltage regulator she had salvaged from a car charger she had found at the Rimrock transfer station. The marine battery she used to run her LED lighting, kept charged by a small solar panel she cleared of snow each morning as a matter of routine. "What are you doing?" Cole's voice carried an edge that had not been there before. The operational awareness underneath the fever and the pain reasserting itself. Norah stripped the proprietary charging cable of the satellite phone down to bare copper. She worked with the focused economy of motion, of someone who has been doing precise manual work for months, whose hands knew tools the way other people's hands knew keyboards. "What are you doing?" Cole repeated. More urgent now. "Taking control of the situation," she said. She connected the voltage regulator into the circuit between the bare copper leads and the battery terminals, protecting the phone's charging system from the raw 12-volt output. It was a delicate connection, too much current, and she would destroy the phone's charging circuitry permanently. She had one chance. She touched the leads to the terminals. Nothing for 4 seconds. Then the phone screen flickered. A startup logo, then a loading bar, then the home screen coming up in sections as the operating system initialized from a cold boot. The signal indicator in the top corner showed no bars. She was underground under 3 feet of compacted earth in a remote mountain county with no cell infrastructure. But the satellite phone did not use cell infrastructure. It used a dedicated satellite network that operated independently of ground-based towers. She picked up the phone, and the battery connected now by a short stretch of spliced cable and crossed the room to the door. She pressed the antenna of the phone against the wooden planks where the door met the frame, the thinnest section of the structure, where the earth was least between her and the sky. 1 bar appeared, faint intermittent blinking. She dialed. The call connected on the 3rd attempt routed through a satellite relay to an emergency dispatch center. She identified herself. She gave her name, and then Gerald's name, and then the name of the investigation and the case number she had memorized during 5 months of legal proceedings. She gave the GPS coordinates that the satellite ping had embedded in the call metadata. She described Cole's condition in clinical terms. She described the tactical transponder on her table and gave the dispatcher enough technical detail that the words private contractor and armed response were clearly understood. And then she said what she had been constructing in her head for the last hour, in the careful way that she constructed arguments for load-bearing specifications, clear, sequential, unambiguous. "My name is Norah Basset. I am the subject of the Basset Federal Fraud Investigation out of Portland, Oregon. I have in my possession the seed phrase to the Harborview cold wallet containing approximately $40 million in diverted retirement funds. I am willing to surrender this information voluntarily to federal authorities. In exchange, I require a federal Medevac helicopter for a man with a critical orthopedic injury. And I require a United States attorney to be available by phone within the next 12 hours to negotiate and execute a blanket immunity agreement covering any outstanding civil liability in the Basset matter. I will not provide the seed phrase until I have spoken with a U.S. attorney and have verbal confirmation of immunity terms. Do you understand what I have told you? The dispatcher's pause lasted 4 seconds. Ma'am, I'm going to need to transfer you to... You can transfer me wherever you need to, Norah said. But write down what I told you first, exactly as I said it, because I'm going to say it the same way to whoever I talk to next, and I want there to be a record from this call. She heard typing, then, Go ahead and repeat it, ma'am. I'm recording. She repeated it, word for word. Then she set the phone down on the plank floor beside the door and stood up and looked across the small earthen room at Cole Draven. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not the operational assessment of a man doing his job. It was not the pain-managed focus of a man managing a severe injury. It was something quieter and more personal. And after a moment, she identified it as the expression of a man who has just watched someone do exactly what he would have done in the same situation if he had been the kind of person who did things that way. They'll freeze the contractors, he said. Once they know the operation is running, they'll freeze everyone. I know, Norah said. The Alliance will lose leverage. I know. The legal recovery will take years. Yes, Norah said, but it will be legal. She looked at him steadily. And your father will get his $280,000 back, every cent, with interest, because that's how federal asset recovery works when there's a clean chain of custody on the funds. She paused. It will take time, but it will be real. Cole looked at the ceiling of the dugout, the planks and pond liner, and 2 feet of compacted Idaho earth that had kept them both alive through 3 days of a storm that should not have happened yet. He looked at it for a long time. The storm will break in about 36 hours, he said finally. Based on the pressure pattern when I came in. Then we have 36 hours, Norah said. She moved to the stove and added 2 more lengths of pine to the fire. The iron cracked and settled as the new fuel caught. I need to check your wound, and then I'm going to sleep for 4 hours. And when I wake up, you're going to tell me everything you know about the Harborview wallet structure, because I need to understand exactly what I'm handing over before I hand it over. She sat down beside him and began unwrapping the compression bandage from his thigh with the methodical attention of someone who intends to be thorough. Norah, Cole said. She looked up. I'm sorry, he said, for coming here the way I came. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the bandaging and continued her work. Tell me about your father, she said. What's his name? A pause. Then quietly, Walter Draven. How long did he work sheet metal? 38 years, same shop, started when he was 29. Did he like it? The question seemed to surprise Cole. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, something underneath the pain and the fever that was older and less defended. Yeah, he said. He was good at it. He said there was something about metal that was honest. It did what physics said it would do. It didn't. He stopped. It didn't lie to you, Norah said. No, Cole said. It didn't lie to you. The stove burned. The storm pushed on the mountain and the mountain held. Somewhere above 3 feet of compacted earth and a waterproof membrane and Douglas fir rafters and the careful hand-cut joinery of a woman who had needed something to build the wind was beginning just barely in the pressure of its gusts to change. The storm did not break so much as exhaust itself. Norah heard it happen in the early hours of October 13th, a gradual diminishment. The way a fever breaks, not in a single moment, but in a slow recession. The body releasing its hold on the crisis by degrees. The roaring that had been constant above 3 feet of earth for 3 days softened first to a sustained moan, then to intermittent gusting, then to a silence so complete that she woke from a light sleep and lay still for several minutes. Certain the silence itself was wrong. It was not wrong, it was just unfamiliar. She checked Cole's temperature, 102.1. Down from the 103.8 it had reached at its peak the previous afternoon, when she had spent 4 hours rotating cold compresses and monitoring his breathing, and running the arithmetic on how long a man could sustain that level of fever before the infection moved from the wound site into the bloodstream in a way that no amount of careful nursing could address. The margin had been narrower than she had allowed herself to acknowledge at the time. It was still narrow, but it had moved in the right direction. His leg concerned her more than the fever. The splint was holding. The compression wrap was intact, and when she had changed the dressing, 12 hours ago the wound had shown signs of the cleaning she had done rather than signs of advancing necrosis. But a compound femur fracture managed with hand tools in a dirt-floored dugout by a structural engineer was not a treated injury. It was a stabilized one. The difference was significant, and the window between stabilized and treated was closing with each hour that passed. She added wood to the stove, put snow on to melt for water, and sat at the plywood table with the leather journal open in front of her. The postcard was insided between pages near the back, exactly where she had placed it in August. She had not examined it closely since the night Cole told her what it contained. She looked at it now with the deliberate attention she brought to structural drawings, reading not just what was present, but what it implied, what loads it was designed to carry, what the designer had understood when they put it together. Gerald's handwriting had always been distinctive. Small, precise letters with no wasted motion. The handwriting of someone trained early to make marks that meant exactly what they needed to mean. The 12 lines on the back of the postcard were written in that hand, and they were exactly as she remembered them. Paired names, one per line, tree and bird, in an order that followed no botanical or ornithological logic she had ever been able to identify. Cedar, hawk, birch, osprey, pine, wren, and so on for 12 lines, each pair separated by a period, the whole thing formatted like a list attempting to disguise itself as verse. She read it slowly, the way you read something when you have been told it contains more than it appears to. The words themselves were unremarkable. The sequence was what mattered, the 12 words in their specific order, functioning as the cryptographic key to a blockchain wallet containing $40 million. She turned the postcard over. The harbor photograph on the front was generic, a calm gray water harbor with a wooden dock and a small boat. The kind of image that existed in 1,000 stock photograph libraries and meant nothing specific. The company name Harborview Wealth Management was printed in a serif font above a Pearl District address that she had looked up once and found was a UPS store. Gerald had gone to some trouble with this. She thought about that. She thought about a man who knew he was running out of time, who knew the fund's collapse was imminent, who had already moved the money and made his arrangements, who was preparing to disappear and understood at some level that disappearing meant dying. The kind of people who help men like Gerald Basset move significant amounts of money across international borders did not value discretion so much as they valued leverage. And leverage had a way of becoming lethal when the money it was predicated on became inaccessible. Gerald had known all of this or something close to it, and he had spent some of his remaining time creating a document that looked like junk mail and contained the key to $40 million. And he had mailed it to the one person he had systematically destroyed, not to retrieve it. She had thought about this through the long hours of nursing Cole's fever and listening to the storm, and she kept arriving at the same place. If Gerald had intended for someone to retrieve the funds for personal use, he would have sent the phrase to a person positioned to act on it quickly and secretly before the forensic accountants mapped the wallet. He would have sent it to a lawyer or a trusted intermediary in a jurisdiction with favorable banking laws. He would not have sent it to a woman whose accounts were frozen and whose freedom of movement was constrained by an ongoing federal investigation. He had sent it to Norah because he knew what Norah would do with it. She did not know when he had arrived at that knowledge. She did not know if it came from 20 years of marriage or from the particular clarity that arrives when a person confronts the end of things and can see without the distortion of self-interest what they have actually built and what they have actually destroyed. She would never know because Gerald Basset was dead in a hotel bathroom in Costa Rica, and the dead do not explain themselves. But she was looking at 12 lines of his handwriting in a small earthen room in the Idaho mountains. And the only interpretation that held up when she tested it against everything she knew about the structure of the situation was that he had sent her the key because he trusted her to use it correctly. Not because he was good, he was not good. The sheet metal workers and the electricians and the long-haul drivers who had lost their retirement savings were not interested in Gerald Bassett's final motivations. And they were right not to be. What he had done could not be made right by what he had intended at the end. The harm was real and permanent and would outlast any gesture. But the key existed, and she was the person holding it. She closed the journal. She sat with her hands flat on the plywood surface and let the weight of what she was about to do settle fully onto her shoulders where it belonged. Not as a burden, as a choice. The distinction mattered. Cole woke at 7 in the morning. The grey light coming through the gap under the canvas at the door had changed quality thinner, clearer the light of a sky that had expelled its weather and was resting. "Pressure changed," he said. His voice was rough but clearer than it had been. The fever was retreating in earnest now, leaving behind a man who was in significant pain and had a long recovery ahead but was provisionally going to survive. "Yes," Norah said, "sometime in the last few hours. The team in Bonner's Ferry will be monitoring weather. When the ceiling lifts to minimums, they'll move." "I know," Norah said. "When I spoke with the duty agent at the FBI field office last night, I gave them the tactical frequency for that transponder." She nodded toward the yellow device still sitting on the table where she had left it. "They disabled the frequency remotely at 3 this morning. The Bell 412 is on the ground and it's staying there. No one is flying into this area without federal authorization." Cole looked at the transponder for a moment. Something in his expression settled not relief exactly, but the release of a contingency he had been holding. "You've been busy," he said. "I had a long night." She brought him a cup of water and helped him sit up enough to drink. "I'm going to give them the phrase," she said. "Everything. Clean chain of custody, voluntary surrender, full cooperation with the federal asset recovery process." He held her gaze over the rim of the cup. "Your father will get his money back," she said. "It will take time, but he will get all of it back." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You could have taken the $5 million, he said. "Not as a challenge, as an observation." "I know. You could have triggered the transponder, handed over the phrase, taken the consideration, and been in a country without an extradition treaty within a week." "Yes," Norah said. "I could have." She sat down across from him. "I spent 25 years building things that other people trusted their weight to. Bridges, buildings, overpasses. People drove over what I built, and they didn't think about it. They didn't have to because the math was right and the structure was sound." She looked at the hands in her lap, the calloused, permanently dirt-stained hands of the past 2 months. "Gerald took that. He took what I built professionally and used it to take what 4,000 other people built over their working lives." She paused. "But I can do this one thing correctly, and then it's done correctly, and whatever comes after this part was sound." Cole looked at her for a long time. The operational distance that had characterized his manner since the moment he first spoke had been replaced by something more direct and unmediated. What remained when you stripped away the professional methodology was simply a man who was exhausted and in pain, and had traveled a long way because his father was working construction at 67 years old, and that was not something he could accept without trying. "Okay," he said. The immunity agreement took 40 minutes to negotiate over a satellite phone standing on the slope outside the dugout in the cold October morning. The Black Hawk sitting on a flat section of the logging trail 100 meters away, and 2 paramedics inside managing Cole's transfer to a portable stretcher. AUSA Patricia Holden was on the line, joined by a supervising attorney from the Asset Recovery Division of the DOJ. Norah did not have her own attorney. She had considered this and decided that the terms were clear enough and her position strong enough that the negotiation was straightforward. She had the phrase. They wanted the phrase. The conditions she had named were reasonable and legally achievable, and the federal government had every incentive to move quickly and cleanly. Blanket civil immunity for any outstanding liability in the Basset matter. Written confirmation transmitted within 24 hours to an email address she specified. A formal acknowledgement that her cooperation was voluntary and unprompted, and would be cited in any subsequent asset recovery proceedings. And the standard finder's consideration from the Federal Asset Recovery Program, which for a recovery of this size was substantial and legal and had no strings attached. She agreed to all of it without hesitation because none of it was the point. The point was the 12 words. She read them into the satellite phone clearly and deliberately one at a time, the way she would have read a specification to a contractor. No ambiguity, no approximation, exactly what the drawing showed. The attorney on the other end confirmed receipt and read them back. They matched. $40 million in a cold wallet on the blockchain, inaccessible since September, accessible now. It would take time. The legal framework for federal cryptocurrency asset recovery was newer than the assets themselves, and there would be proceedings and accountings and distributions that would unfold over months. But the money existed. It had a legal path back to the people it had been taken from. Walter Draven, 67 years old, sheet metal worker of 38 years, would get his $280,000 back. Not today, but it would come with interest, and it would be real. She stood on the slope with the phone in her hand after the call ended and looked down through the trees to the gorge below, where the creek ran under a skin of new ice. The valley beyond the gorge was white and still. The storm snow undisturbed on the slopes below the tree line, the sky above it the color of a clear intention. The federal agent who handled the physical evidence collection was a woman named Caruth, methodical and thorough, who documented the contents of the Pelican case and the tactical transponder and the manila folder with the systematic attention of someone building a case that needed to be airtight. "The transponder," Norah said when Caruth reached it. "I need to understand that it's fully neutralized. Frequency was disabled remotely at 0300 this morning." Caruth confirmed, turning the device over and pointing to a small LED indicator that showed red. "Our technical team locked the transmission band before the weather broke. The contractors in Bonners Ferry had no capability to act even if they tried." She tagged the device and set it in the evidence bag. "They were detained at 0600, all four. The helicopter is impounded." Norah nodded. She signed the custody receipts with the black Sharpie she had used to write the seed phrase on her arm, one document at a time, with the calm deliberation of a person who has decided exactly what they are doing and why. Caruth asked Norah if she wanted to press charges against Cole Draven personally. Norah thought about this for a moment, standing on the slope with the mountain behind her, and the valley below her, and the cold clear air of a post-storm morning filling her lungs. "No," she said. Caruth noted the answer without visible opinion. They brought Cole out on the stretcher while Norah was finishing with Caruth. She heard the paramedics before she saw them, the careful communication of two people managing a critical patient over uneven ground, the creak of the stretcher frame on the snow. She stepped to the side of the trail to let them pass. Cole was pale, his jaw set against the pain of movement, his eyes fixed on the sky above the ridgeline, the first open sky he had seen in 4 days. He looked in that moment like a man recalibrating to a world that was larger than the one he had been surviving in. As the stretcher drew level with her, his eyes came down from the sky and found her face. She had expected him to say something about the case, about the alliance or the contractors or the legal process that would now take its course without him. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the directness of a man who has run out of the energy required for anything other than honesty. "He's going to want to thank you himself," Cole said. "My father, when this is over." Norah held his gaze. "Tell him it came from the right place," she said. "That's all." Cole looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked back up at the sky, and the paramedics moved him past, and the sound of the stretcher on snow faded down the trail toward the helicopter. She stood on the slope for a long time after they had gone. The logging trail was quiet. The trees stood in the particular stillness of trees after a storm has moved through them, each one bearing the weight of new snow on its branches, with the patient structural economy of things designed by long experience to hold what falls on them. She went back inside. The dugout without Cole in it was the size it had always been, 12 feet by 16 feet, the timber framing clean and sound in the lantern light that was still burning from the long night. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the space that had over the past 4 days become something different from what she had built it to be. She had built it to keep the world out. It had in the end held the world in, contained a crisis, managed an emergency, sheltered 2 people through something that had no right to resolve as cleanly as it was resolving. She looked at the place on the dirt floor, where Cole had lain, the impression in the earth, the dark stain at the edge of it that the cold had preserved. She looked at the central pillar where the rope was still tied, the trucker's hitch still in place, the physical record of a mechanical problem solved under pressure with what was available. Then she looked at the stove still burning on a low feed, and the plywood shelf with the lantern and the wooden cot frame with the sleeping bag still draped across it, and the toolbox on the shelf beside the stove where the wire strippers and the voltage regulator sat beside a roll of duct tape and 3 spare batteries. This was what she had made. It was rough and improvised and built under duress, and it had worked. She crossed the room, picked up the journal from the table and tucked it under her arm. The postcard was gone with Caruth tagged and documented, beginning its journey through the federal evidence process. What remained in the journal was her own record, the notes from the excavation, the timber calculations, the daily observations of temperature and wind and progress. And in the last several pages, the clinical notes she had kept on Cole's condition, the temperature logs, the wound assessments, the timing of every intervention. She read back through the construction notes, briefly standing at the table. The entries from the first days were terse and exhausted. The entries from the middle weeks were more detailed, the writing of someone who had found a rhythm. The most recent entries from the week before the storm were almost calm, the tone of someone who had assessed the situation and knew what needed to happen and was doing it. She had not noticed that change while it was occurring. She noticed it now. She closed the journal and set it on the shelf beside the toolbox. There was a call she needed to make. Not to federal authorities, that was done. A personal call to a woman named Harriet Sloan in Portland, who had worked for 5 months to clear Norah's name and had kept her number active in Norah's phone through everything that followed. Harriet deserved to hear this from Norah herself before she read it anywhere else. That call required a signal, which required driving down the mountain. She would drive down today, get a room in Rimrock, eat a meal at a table, make the calls that needed to be made, sleep in a bed for one night, and return in the morning. She held the word for a moment, the way you hold something that has changed its weight. Return. Not escape, not disappear, not the vocabulary of someone fleeing something. The vocabulary of someone who has somewhere to come back to. She needed to talk to Silas Thorne, the rest of his ridge, the acres running north and south from her 5. She wanted to know what he would take for it. Not for expansion, not for any grand plan, but because this mountain had earned her loyalty in a way that nothing she had owned before had, and she was not interested in being a partial resident of it. She would pour a proper foundation, not excavate it into the slope that had been the right solution for the emergency that was now over. A real foundation, concrete and rebar engineered to code with drawings she would produce herself and have stamped by a licensed engineer. And she would smile when she looked at those drawings, because she would understand every line of them in her hands as well as her mind. She would build windows, floor to ceiling, south-facing, looking out over the gorge and the valley below. She would sit behind those windows in the mornings with coffee and watch the light come up over the Selkirks. She would watch the snow come in November, the real snow. The snow that arrived on the schedule it was supposed to arrive on, and she would watch it from inside, something she had built to last. She was 54 years old. She had 25 years of structural engineering knowledge in her head and 2 months of knowledge in her hands that no classroom had ever offered, and a name that was, as of this morning, beginning its return to her. Not restored, that was not the right word. Returned. Given back to its owner, who had kept the receipts. Before she left the dugout, she did one final thing. She took the black Sharpie from her coat pocket, the one she had used to write the seed phrase on her forearm that morning. The 12 words that were now in federal custody, beginning their long journey back to the people they belonged to. And she uncapped it. On the timber of the central pillar at eye level, where the rope anchor was still tied from the night she had rigged the pulley system to save Cole Draven's leg, she wrote a single line in her engineer's block letters. She wrote, "This held." She looked at it for a moment. Then she capped the Sharpie and put it in her pocket. She put on her coat. She checked the stove damper and turned it to its lowest setting. Not out because a fire going cold in an unoccupied structure was a different kind of risk, and she would be back before dark tomorrow. She picked up her keys from the hook she had driven into the timber frame on the second day of construction, before she had anything else to hang them on, because she had understood even then that she was building a place where she intended to return. She stepped out of the dugout and pulled the door closed behind her. The slope was white and brilliant in the October morning, the storm snow undisturbed except for the trails left by the rescue team and the long straight compression marks where the stretcher had passed. Above the tree line, the sky was the deep hard blue of high altitude after weather, the kind of blue that has no ambiguity in it, no reservation, no coming and going. Just the full clean fact of itself. The helicopter was gone. The logging trail was empty. The mountain was returned to the quiet that was its natural condition, interrupted periodically by weather and human beings, and the ordinary events of a wilderness that did not organize itself around human convenience and never had. Norah stood on the slope and looked down through the trees to the gorge below, where the creek moved under its skin of new ice, and beyond the gorge to the valley that spread out in white and gray, and the dark lines of the fir stands on the far slopes. She had looked at this view every day for 6 weeks from this same spot in various states of exhaustion and resolve and occasional despair. And she had never once looked at it and seen anything other than what it was, which was she had come to understand one of its primary virtues. She started down the logging trail toward the Subaru, her boots compressing the new snow, with each step leaving a clear track behind her. The air was cold in the way that mountain air after a storm is always cold clean, and absolute, containing within its chill the simple fact of altitude and latitude and the season, with no editorializing. At the point where the logging trail curved and the dugout disappeared from view behind the tree line, she stopped. She did not look back. She had already looked. She knew what was there. She turned her face toward the valley and walked. The mountain behind her kept its silence, the way mountains always do not. The silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that has absorbed what happened within it and holds it now as part of itself. Unremarkable, permanent, the way all things that have truly been tested and held become permanent. It had stopped the cold at her door. It had held the weight of the storm. It had kept its own counsel about everything that happened inside it. Mountains, as Norah had learned, did not give back what they took. They simply incorporated it. The labor she had put into the slope, the timber she had cut and joined the earth she had moved by hand and machine, the blood that had soaked into the dirt floor of the dugout on the night of October 10th, all of it was part of the mountain now, as the mountain was part of her. She walked the rest of the trail to the Subaru with the particular gait of a person who is going somewhere specific and knows the way, not hurrying, not hesitating. Simply moving through the world at the pace that the terrain and the light and the distance to be covered required. She started the engine. It turned over on the first try the way it always did, the way she had come to trust it to do. She let it warm for a moment, watching the condensation clear from the windshield in spreading arcs. Then she put it in gear and drove down toward Rimrock, toward a phone signal, toward a conversation with Harriet Sloane that was long overdue, toward a meal at a table and a bed that was not a cot, toward the ordinary reclaimed business of a life that had not been taken from her. After all, only interrupted, only tested, only stripped down to its foundation to see what would hold. What had held was considerable. She drove down out of the mountains into the valley, and behind her on a 45-degree slope in Boundary County, Idaho. A dugout structure built into the hillside by a woman with hand tools and a clear understanding of load distribution sat in the post-storm quiet with 2 feet of earth on its roof and 3 words on its central pillar, and a fire still burning low in the cast-iron stove. And it held as it had been built to hold, against everything the mountain and the season and the particular difficult autumn of that year had brought to bear against it. It would still be standing in the spring. Norah Basset had made certain of that.